One man, five suspected victims, murders linked to multiple states, Florida, California, Mississippi, Ohio, and Louisiana. A young mother found murdered inside a Tampa motel room, a deadly trail stretching across America, a nationwide investigation, a pursuit ending near Waco, Kentucky, and nearly 30 years later, an execution inside Florida State Prison on May 15, 2025. This was not just another murder case. Investigators believed they were hunting a serial killer moving from state to state, a man who could appear friendly, charming, even trustworthy, before turning violent. On May 15, 2025, at approximately 6:16 p.m., after spending nearly 3 decades on death row, Glen Edward Rogers was executed by lethal injection in the state of Florida. He had been convicted of the 1995 murder of Tina Marie Cribbs, a 34-year-old mother whose death helped investigators uncover what authorities believed was a far darker pattern of violence. According to investigators, women in different states vanished after encountering the same man. A red-haired drifter with an easy smile and a dangerous secret. Inside the execution chamber, official witnesses and victim family members watched as the lethal injection process began. But even after decades of investigation, one chilling question still haunts this case today. How was Glen Rogers able to move from state to state, choosing victims, gaining their trust, killing without mercy, and escaping capture again and again? Was he simply lucky, or was he far more calculating than investigators first realized? And what mistake finally caused everything to come crashing down after the murder of Tina Cribbs? What led authorities to the man they would later call the Casanova Killer? We'll come back to the execution later, because before the death sentence, before the nationwide manhunt, and before America knew his name, there was already a deadly pattern hiding in plain sight. If you enjoy detailed true crime documentaries like this, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications for more chilling cases every week. And while you're watching, let us know you thought in the comments. Welcome to All True Crime Network. Now, to understand how this story truly began, we need to go back to 1995. It was November 5th, 1995, in Tampa, Florida. For most people, it was an ordinary Sunday evening, but by the time that night ended, a brutal crime had already begun a chain of events that investigators would later connect to multiple states across America. That evening, Tina Marie Cribbs had been spending time in the area after meeting a man she had recently become acquainted with. Witness accounts later described him as a tall man with red hair, calm, confident, and able to easily engage people around him. At the time, nothing about the interaction appeared immediately dangerous. No signs of struggle in public, no distress, no alarm raised by witnesses. But sometime after that encounter, Tina Cribbs disappeared. In the hours and days that followed, concern began to grow among family and friends as attempts to reach her failed. Then came the discovery that would transform the case from a missing person report into a homicide investigation. Tina's body was found inside a motel room in Tampa. According to investigative findings, she had suffered multiple stab wounds. The room showed clear signs of a violent struggle, disarray consistent with a confrontation that escalated quickly and fatally. Nothing suggested a random act of violence. Instead, investigators believed this was a targeted attack, one where the offender likely had personal contact with the victim before the killing occurred. As detectives processed the scene, they began building a timeline. Witnesses soon provided a crucial lead. A red-haired drifter had been seen with Tina shortly before she vanished. That detail immediately stood out, because unknown to investigators in Florida at the time, similar descriptions were already appearing in other jurisdictions, other states, other women, other deaths beginning to show disturbing similarities. And as that realization slowly formed inside the investigation, one critical question emerged. Was this an isolated murder, or the first confirmed piece of a much larger, far more dangerous pattern? But before investigators could connect those dots, they needed to understand who Tina Cribbs was and what led her into the path of the man she met that night. And that is where this story truly begins. Before this case became part of a larger investigation, Tina Marie Cribbs was simply a mother trying to build a stable life for her family. Those who knew her described her as outgoing, warm, and deeply caring, someone who valued her relationships and was known for her ability to connect easily with people around her. She was in her 30s, balancing the everyday responsibilities of work, life, and raising children. Friends said Tina had a trusting nature, the kind of person who gave people the benefit of the doubt, even strangers. But behind that ordinary life was a vulnerability she never could have foreseen. On the night of November 5th, 1995, Tina was last seen after spending time with a man she had recently met. Witnesses later recalled the interaction as casual, nothing alarming at the time. The two appeared to be talking normally, with no visible signs of conflict or fear, but investigators would later believe that this single meeting marked the beginning of a deadly sequence of events. Because shortly after that night, Tina disappeared, and when police began retracing her final movements, they realized something unsettling. The man she had been seen with was not unknown to law enforcement circles for long. As detectives worked to understand who Tina was in her final hours, another realization began to form in the background of the investigation. This wasn't just about one victim anymore. There were signs, patterns, similarities emerging in other places. And slowly investigators began to focus on one critical question: who exactly was the man Tina Cribbs met that night? Because the more they learned about him, the more dangerous the picture became. And that question would soon lead them directly into the name that would define this case: Glen Edward Rogers. But before authorities fully understood what they were dealing with, they needed to look at the man behind the charm and the history that may have been warning them all along. Glen Edward Rogers was born in 1962 in Hamilton, Ohio. From early on, his life was marked by instability and repeated trouble with authority. As he grew older, that pattern did not disappear. It escalated. But what made Rogers stand out was not just his criminal behavior. It was how easily he could switch between two identities. To some people, he appeared polite, confident, even charismatic. To investigators who later studied his movements, he appeared to use that charm strategically, especially in environments where trust came quickly and suspicion came too late. As detectives began connecting scattered cases across different states, a disturbing pattern started to emerge. A 71-year-old man in Ohio, Mark Peters, who had once offered Rogers shelter, later vanished under suspicious circumstances. In California, Sandra Gallagher, a mother of three, was last seen with Rogers in a bar before being found dead shortly after. In Mississippi, Linda Price, a single mother, was later discovered inside her apartment under violent conditions that mirrored other cases. And in Florida, Tina Marie Cribbs, a young mother, was last seen leaving a bar with Rogers before her body was discovered in a motel room bathtub. A detail investigators noted appeared repeatedly in related cases. Across every location, the same pattern kept appearing. Women meeting a charismatic stranger, sudden disappearances, violent crime scenes, and a man who was already gone by the time authorities began connecting the dots. Even more unsettling was how mobile he appeared to be. Each time investigators focused on one location, another state would surface with a similar report. And with every new case, one question began to grow louder inside the investigation. Was this a series of unrelated crimes, or the movements of a single individual leaving a trail across the country? At this point, investigators were no longer dealing with isolated homicide cases. They were beginning to suspect something far more dangerous: a pattern, a traveling offender, a man who seemed to appear, connect, and disappear before anyone could stop him. And as the puzzle pieces started to align across state lines, the focus of the entire investigation began narrowing toward one name. But before authorities could fully understand who they were dealing with, they first needed to find out exactly how far the trail of this man truly went. And that realization would soon push the case into its most critical phase, the investigation that would finally bring everything together. After the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs, investigators in Florida immediately began retracing her final known movements. Witness statements pointed to the same figure: a red-haired man seen with Tina shortly before she disappeared. That description became the first critical thread, and once it entered law enforcement databases, it began connecting to something much larger. As detectives followed the trail, they identified Glen Edward Rogers as a person of interest, but by that time, he was already gone from Florida. That disappearance was not random. It triggered a wider, multi-state investigation. As investigators compared unsolved cases, a disturbing pattern emerged. In California, Sandra Gallagher had been last seen with Rogers before her burned vehicle was discovered in Kentucky. In Mississippi and other states along his path, similar victim profiles and timelines began to surface. Each case shared the same chilling structure. A woman meets a charismatic stranger, then vanishes. Then a violent discovery follows shortly after. And the same name kept reappearing across state lines. Rogers. Authorities now believed they were dealing with a traveling suspect moving through multiple jurisdictions. A nationwide alert was initiated. Law enforcement agencies across several states began coordinating efforts to track his movements. Then, in mid-November 1995, the investigation reached its turning point. On November 13, 1995, in Kentucky, a routine patrol observation escalated into a full-scale pursuit. A Kentucky State Police detective spotted a man driving a vehicle linked to Tina Marie Cribbs. The vehicle had been reported stolen. What followed was a high-speed chase involving multiple officers, including local police and state troopers. Officers attempted to stop the vehicle, but the suspect continued driving. A roadblock was eventually established ahead. During the pursuit, officers attempted to disable the vehicle. When it continued moving, a patrol unit used a tactical maneuver to force it off the roadway. The car was brought to a stop after leaving the highway and entering a ditch. Surrounded by officers, the driver was taken into custody. That driver was identified as Glen Edward Rogers. A local news crew captured parts of the chase and arrest as it unfolded. Inside the vehicle, investigators also recovered items connected to the victim. During initial questioning, Rogers gave conflicting explanations about how he came into possession of the car. Authorities later reported that he made inconsistent and unsettling statements during early interrogation, further deepening suspicion. At this point, investigators believed they had not just arrested a suspect in one murder, but potentially a man linked to a wider pattern of killings across multiple states. Prosecutors began assembling their case using witness accounts placing Rogers with victims, forensic and physical evidence recovered from crime scenes, travel patterns across state lines, timelines linking disappearances to his movements, and recovered property connected to victims. For the first time, law enforcement had a suspect in custody who matched a multi-state pattern of violence they were only beginning to fully understand. But while the arrest marked a major breakthrough, it was only the beginning of an even larger battle, because now prosecutors had to prove in court what investigators believed they had uncovered, that this was not a series of unrelated crimes, but the work of a single man, moving across America in the shadows. And as the case moved toward trial, the evidence would be tested in ways investigators could not yet predict. After his arrest in November 1995, Glen Edward Rogers was extradited back to Florida to face trial for the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. After the arrest and investigation, the case of Glen Edward Rogers moved into the courtroom, where prosecutors began laying out a pattern they believed was far more than a single isolated murder. At trial, the state of Florida argued that Rogers deliberately targeted vulnerable women before murdering them in violent attacks. A key part of the prosecution's case came from witness testimony, including accounts placing Rogers with Tina Marie Cribbs shortly before her disappearance in November 1995. Prosecutors reinforced their argument with forensic findings recovered from the crime scene, along with timeline evidence that tracked Rogers' movements across multiple states. They painted a consistent picture: a man who gained trust easily, traveled frequently, and left behind a pattern of violent outcomes wherever he went. In court, prosecutors described Rogers as manipulative, predatory, and extremely dangerous, emphasizing that the evidence, when viewed together, formed a coherent and repeated behavioral pattern. The defense pushed back. They challenged portions of the physical evidence and questioned whether the prosecution had correctly interpreted certain connections between the crimes. They also argued that some aspects of the case relied heavily on circumstantial links rather than direct eyewitness confirmation of the murders. But as the trial progressed, the broader narrative presented to the jury became increasingly difficult to dismiss. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of murder. Rogers was sentenced to death in the state of Florida. But the legal battle did not end there. After his conviction, Rogers filed an appeal to the Florida Supreme Court, arguing that the evidence presented at trial was insufficient to support the charges against him. He also claimed that the trial court had erred by denying defense motions for mistrial, particularly regarding testimony that referenced a prior misdemeanor conviction in California, which the defense argued unfairly influenced the jury. That appeal process extended into the early 2000s and was ultimately denied in March 2001. Years later, as his execution date approached, Rogers again turned to the courts. On May 5, 2025, his legal team filed a final appeal to the Florida Supreme Court, arguing that childhood trauma should have been considered during sentencing, along with concerns regarding the lethal injection protocol. That request was denied on May 9, 2025. With time running out, attorneys made one final emergency appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States. On May 14, 2025, just one day before the scheduled execution, that final request was rejected. At that moment, all legal avenues had been exhausted. Years earlier, Rogers had also received a separate death sentence in California for the murder of Sandra Gallagher, reinforcing the scope of his convictions across state lines. Over the years, Rogers continued making controversial and often disputed claims linking himself to other crimes. However, investigators consistently dismissed these statements due to lack of verified evidence. Despite decades of appeals and legal challenges, one outcome remained unchanged. The state of Florida had maintained its sentence, and after nearly 30 years of legal proceedings, the final stage of the case was now set in motion. The execution was no longer a possibility. It was scheduled, and the last 24 hours of Glen Rogers' life were about to begin. Now we return to May 15, 2025. After nearly 30 years on death row, 62-year-old Glen Edward Rogers was escorted into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. Inside the chamber, the final phase of the sentence began. At 6:16 p.m., Rogers was pronounced dead following lethal injection. Earlier that day, he received his final meal. According to official reports, his request was simple: pizza, chocolate cake, and soda. As the final moments approached, witnesses described Rogers as calm and composed while the procedure was carried out. Then came his final statement. In a message directed toward the families of victims and also referencing then U.S. President Donald Trump, Rogers said, "I know there's a lot of questions that you need answers to. I promise you in the near future, the questions will be answered, and I hope in some way will bring you closure. President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to go." Shortly after the lethal injection process was completed, at exactly 6:16 p.m., the state of Florida officially pronounced him dead. For the families connected to the crimes of Tina Marie Cribbs and others linked to the case, the execution marked the end of a decades-long journey through investigation, trial, and legal appeals. But even with the sentence carried out, the uncertainty did not disappear. How many victims were truly connected to Glen Rogers? Did investigators uncover every crime linked to his movements across multiple states? Or did some cases remain unsolved, quietly left behind as he moved from place to place? That question is what continues to surround this case today. Because in true crime, justice can close a chapter, but it doesn't always close the story. And sometimes, the most unsettling cases are not the ones that end in court, but the ones that leave unanswered questions behind them. Before you go, tell us in the comments, do you believe Glen Edward Rogers' confirmed cases represent the full truth? Or is there still more that was never discovered? You've been watching All True Crime Network. If you enjoy true crime documentaries like this, subscribe and turn on notifications for more weekly cases. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.